I'm Lisa Panzera. I'm the director of the Fiterman Art Center. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to all of you for being here and for these incredible projects. There are sort of more proper bios on your seats, so I won't go into lengthy bios and take up too much time. I'll do some super quick kind of Reader's Digest ones, just so everybody knows who's who. Jean-Marc Superville Sovak. Ooh.
There we go.
Wow. Okay.
Now you have to
Oh, that's scary. It sounded like Minions or something. So you are a multidisciplinary artist and teaching professional. Many of Jean-Marc's works retrace the speculative steps of the Underground Railroad across historic sites in the Hudson Valley, where he lives. He has designed memorials to Afro-Dutch pioneers, created oral history projects, given lectures at colleges, universities, cultural institutions, and done site-specific projects like this one that surrounds us right now. Johannah, also a multidisciplinary artist, is based in Brooklyn. She's done multiple residencies, participated in numerous exhibitions in the US and abroad. She's doing like sort of 3 things simultaneously right now, and teaches at Parsons, Pratt, and NYU. Cara Marsh Sheffler is a writer, translator, and editor whose work has appeared in many publications, including The Guardian and Vice. She and Johannah's collaborative work, known as Agit Pop Press, has been featured in by NADA, by Frieze, and other venues. And their most recent publication made for this exhibition on display via Jean-Marc is called White Flight. And last but not least, Andrea Mosterman is Associate Professor in Atlantic History and the Joseph Tregle Professor in Early American History at the University of New Orleans. She researches slavery and the slave trade in the Dutch Atlantic world with an emphasis on early New York, and her book, Spaces of Enslavement, A History of Slavery and Resistance in Dutch New York, won the 2020 Hendricks Award for Best Book-Length Manuscript relating to New Netherlands and the Dutch colonial experience, and we're lucky to have you, so thank you for being here. So just to sort of start things off, I will just note that the 2 exhibitions that we're showing side by side seem at first to be very far apart, both in time and in topic. But to my thinking, there is a thread that connects the 2. And it begins with enslavement as integral to the inception and development of New York, and connects to New York's relationship to Black citizens 300 plus years later. So Andrea, in your book, Spaces of Enslavement, you address the movements of enslaved people and the ways they were controlled in both the domestic and the public spaces, and the way that the built environment had an enormous impact on enslaved people, how public spaces were designated as white spaces through the use of architecture, legislation, and surveillance. And it seems to me that in the 20th century, we encounter that same kind of use of spatial planning, legislation, and surveillance that plays out particularly in the policies and practices implemented by none other than Robert Moses, who played probably the single largest role in shaping the physical environment of New York in the 20th century. And that's something that you guys have investigated. And just to note that he was in fact president of the New York World's Fair from 1960 to 66, and I have this really fascinating list of all of the offices he held, and all of those were simultaneous from approximately 1933 to 60, 63, 34, and the last one, chairman of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, was from 34 to 81. So, yeah, amazing. So, Andrea, I thought we could sort of begin at the beginning of New York and of this story of this exhibition, and maybe you could sort of start us off, particularly regarding this issue of control of spaces used to control people.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful, and this is such an amazing exhibit, and so is the other exhibit. It's really, you know, for me especially, to see the story, of course, of these people that I've worked on for so long. It's really amazing to see that. One of the things when thinking about the increased control and the way that these different stories really connect is the fact that, you know, the men that we see here, they were able to do things that would be increasingly difficult in New York, and that is in large part because of this increased these increasing efforts to control the movements and activities of Black New Yorkers. And that does not mean that in the 17th century the Dutch were, you know, these very progressive people who did not think of that. It was just something that over time developed as slavery expanded in the region. And one of the things you can really see then is that through legislation, Black New Yorkers would need to show a pass to prove that they were legitimately moving from one area to another. They would no longer be allowed, and this really starts by the latter part of the 17th century, and legislation increases into the 18th century. They would no longer be allowed to sell goods without permission of their enslavers. They would not allow to purchase any alcohol. So what we see is that increasingly there's, in the built environment, forms of surveillance to be able to watch people, to watch their movements, to control their movements. And we also see that there's, with these pass systems and all this legislation, there are these, sometimes referred to as riders, but really any individual who would see a Black person in public spaces would be in their right to demand to see proof that they were legitimately in those spaces. And I think that that is where the main thread is, that when we look at today, we still see that, right? We still see that oftentimes Black people have to prove that they're legitimately in certain spaces, and that anybody can demand that from them. Any white person can demand that proof in some ways from Black people. And so this is where I think some of those main threads are very visible. And if anybody knows the work of Elijah Anderson, he talks about this, about white space, and it's really, he has a great article on it. He published more recently a book, I think it came out in January of this year. He's a sociologist who looks at this concept of white space and how Black people are allowed to be in these white spaces because they have to travel through them or they have to work in them, but they're always at risk of being investigated, interrogated, or even physically harmed. And I think that we see the origins of that in early America, and really starting in the late 17th and early 18th century.
I think they did manage to consume alcohol. There was still, with pass or no pass.
Absolutely. Oh, now it's on. You're right, and this is what's so interesting, right? Is that there's this arrogance of presuming that you can control those spaces and that you can control those people, when really you can never do so. And you constantly see people, they just navigate the streets differently at different times or in different ways, or they go through backyards and back alleys instead of the main road. So yes, they definitely were still consuming alcohol and doing all the other things that they were not allowed to do.
So that issue actually sort of speaks to this issue on the one hand of sort of marginalization, having to occupy space kind of at the margins of white spaces. But I think that you talk a little bit, and you definitely sort of start to address this in this project, but the idea of that also being used as a form of resistance. And this story of these 9 enslaved laborers who stood together and kind of using the system in a way as a form of resistance.
I mean, that's my main question is, as someone who is involved in speculation and not the work that, I like to think that I pick up where you leave off. I mean, my only question is this okay? Like, is this okay with you in the sense that, the limits of what is available to us in some of these documents and some of what, is the written history and then sort of the unwritten history, somebody told me a story about the wife of a very well-known religious scholar who rearranged the books on his bedside just when he was dying, so that all his favorite theologians were right there, right next to him, while she took out the copy of the Daily News, whatever he was actually reading. So can you have a lie that tells the truth? I guess is sort of what I'm saying. Like, this is all speculative. This is all critical fabulation, if you like. But I rely and I'm very much indebted to the work of historians. I don't know if you feel the same too, for slogging through documents that almost didn't even manage to exist till this very day. So are you okay with me? Do I have your approval?
Yes. Yes, but and just to add, I mean, I think it's wonderful. It's a way of, one of the challenges, and this is where the 17th century in some ways is exceptional for the Dutch. We have so many documents in a way of the enslaved people, although they're not really in their own voices, right? But we can tell more complex stories about them. We see enslaved people in the 17th century in the council minutes. We see them in the courts, in the New Amsterdam courts. We see them and they're in the courts to fight for unpaid wages, for example, or to protect their property. They're actually actively using the courts. We see them in the church records. So we can tell a story about them, but there's always a big part of the history missing when we look at the history of enslaved people, because so few of the records by enslaved people actually either were created or were preserved. And so historians are always looking for ways to fill in those gaps and to kind of tell a more complex story about these people. They were not just enslaved people, right? They were human beings. They had families. They loved, they cried, they lied, they did all these things. And so I think that this is a really wonderful way of kind of attempting to fill in some of those gaps. And especially using the work of Rubens, who was living in Amsterdam and producing this work based on Africans living in Amsterdam, which is, also adding to that history of slavery and Black people in the Dutch Atlantic world that we're still kind of reconstructing. So, whereas for such a long time, these people were kept out of the history books and were neglected and ignored, we see with these types of exhibits and this work, we see them being placed very physically sometimes back into those spaces. And that's, I think, incredibly important. So sorry, that's a very long yes, but yes.
So this notion of resistance kind of relates to the notion of subversion. I'm thinking a little bit about the work that you guys do and the way that you take those historical documents and you subvert them. So I was wondering if you could talk about that practice a little bit and how you first started doing it, actually.
As in like the collaboration, how we first started, or?
And this practice of using documents to then... We can't, okay.
So in terms of subversion, my work has been subversive in terms of that being the underlying thread of how I approach all my subject matter for many years now. the idea of bringing documents and like specific archives into it is relatively recent. I think it's mostly with the collaboration I've been having with Cara. But the reason for that is, you know, a couple conflating reasons, but one of which is that I want so often, and I mean, I love this work so much because it gets you immediately in a space of being like, oh, this is some like intense, critical, like you know that you're gonna get into some really deep subject matter as soon as you walk into this space. And so I kind of come about it from the opposite end, where like, I don't want you to know that you're gonna eat grape nuts. It's gonna, like, you think you're getting Frosted Flakes, and then you're like, shit, you know? Like, once you've already put it in your mouth, you know, I want, especially because I think a lot about people who are not used to looking at art in like very serious art spaces and museums. And so like I first started really getting into the kind of subversive stuff with a collaboration with my husband, where we did a whole project that was performative and had sculptures, but it was all about professional wrestling and looking at like professional wrestling and like kayfabe, which is the continuation of the mythologizing of the characters, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes, as this metaphor for the American dream that we kind of, we know it's alive, but we keep it up to a certain extent. So, but that idea that like someone who is really not interested in art necessarily, but might be really into professional wrestling, which is a sort of, also talking about class, right, and these different sort of cultures, that they might get interested in it just from that perspective. So I think a lot about like consumerism and wanting to make something that makes you have a consumerist desire for it before you can intellectualize it. And then you're already half implicated in it because you want it. Yeah.
And I'm really... You know what, that's actually a really good idea. Yeah, so I was just going to say that basically Johannah and I began working together on a project that presented, she did a bunch of war rugs, Afghan war rugs, that kind of used the visual strategy of Afghan war rugs to talk about American problems like the Flint water crisis and the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And the thing about original Afghan war rugs was that they became so popular with soldiers that they were eventually available in the Sears catalog on Sears.com. So when we decided to get together and work on something, she asked me to do the curatorial essay. It was one of these things where 3 glasses of wine later, we said like, oh man, let's do a Sears catalog. So we did that, and we kind of really began talking about portraying American decline as what it is, which is a consumer experience, and that this is all about buying into our dystopia. So I think that that was kind of how we came to the World's Fair, you know, through Johannah's notion of materiality and seduction and colorways that she's talking about. And for me, it was this, whole idea of who's modeling utopia, and that brings us back to Robert Moses, and of course, who we wouldn't know about in the way that we do without Robert Caro. And I think that was sort of the path, and what was being sold in the American dream, as Johannah said. So yeah.
Sears catalog was the first like archival thing that we all right, we have to find. We also just wanted to start in the 1970s because who doesn't love like 1970s aesthetic? But so I just got like a 1974 Sears catalog, and then in order to scan the pages and to really like go deep into the graphic design strategies of that, which is so wacky. And so that was the first time that we were like, oh, let's get this like primary source and then use it to be subversive. And then we've had a couple of projects since then that are taking different mid-century publication, like print materials, and switching it up.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really interesting about some of the materials that you use are how kind of wacky they are to begin with. You think this can't really be real, and I'm thinking about the refrigerator ad, right, with the space age refrigerator. So thank you so much for having all the documents. I don't know if I can quickly find it, but yes, here we go. This.
Sorry. My notes.
Just throwing your notes on. But that image, right? It seems like it's completely made up, and yet that's the part of it that's actually the original thing. And then your text obviously is playing with that and subverting that. But I mean, it's pretty fascinating just from visual perspective, but also like, what the hell is it saying, right? You know.
That I think is kind of part of, you know, why choose. I mean, there's many reasons for the mid-century, which we could get into in terms of like our interest in the collaboration, but also the fact that like the sort of design and the ads from that period are so wacky, right? So it is, again, in my opinion, is like an entry point to be like what is this weird? They're wearing, you know, the astronaut thing. Anyways, before you even really know like what it is that is being sold and then how we're subverting it, but just because like the ads were just so wild.
Yeah, I think one of the strategies that you employ that's really effective in that way is the wallpaper, right? So this like wild or psychedelic 1960s wallpaper, and then when you get up close and you squint your eyes, you see this embedded text, and then you start to realize that this is language from these, you know, racially restrictive covenants. And so I think that the way that you're pointing to or describing the literal embeddedness of these policies through that device, I think is, you know, super interesting. And again, pulling people in then to show them the kind of underbelly, really, you know, which kind of leads me to the issue of contracts, because in thinking about some of this, it seems like contracts are another really central way in which people of color are controlled in terms of space in particular. And I'm thinking about those racially restrictive covenants, which actually are even more binding, right, than contracts. And then I'm thinking about the agreements like the conditional freedom agreement, right? Like, well, you're free, but not really. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because we've spoken a bit about that, and I think that the way that you've installed the show speaks so much to that.
Yeah, I think what I'm so grateful for in terms of having learned of the story of Manuel de Gerrit de Roos. Does everybody know the story of what's happening here in this room? This is a story of 9 Afro-Dutch men who were accused of murder. And what's so particular about the story and the way that it embodies a history that's otherwise just numbers and contracts and court documents and, you know, sort of pretty banal sounding stuff, is that there is the evidence, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if you're willing to go there, but the evidence of these 9 black men collectively leveraging their value, what they understood as their value with the Dutch West India Company, and saying basically, you know, if we are all accused of this crime, if we're all going to pay for this crime, that they were actually better off in solidarity, together guilty, than individually innocent. And so when they all lock arms and they said, we're all guilty of the crime, and the Dutch Colonial Council said, no, wait a minute. It doesn't take 9 guys to kill another man. Like, who's responsible? And they said, no. We are each as guilty, one as the other. To me, that is sort of that embodiment of a history that you wouldn't necessarily be able to grasp at when you're talking about colonialism in a sort of very sort of abstract sense. I know there's some folks here who are involved in talking about colonialism as a very real thing. I'm pointing to you. Chris has made a great movie about the water resistance in Cajamarca in Peru. The idea that colonialism is not it is numbers. It's very mercantile. It's capitalism on a very contractual level. But the real world repercussions of that, what Rebecca Hall is another historian, she wrote a story, the history of women-led slave revolts. 9 out of 10 of the slave revolts that happened on all ships, these are just the numbers, were led by women. That's a fact. That's just the numbers. They don't lie. So that's a story again. How do we know history? How do we learn it? How do we unforget it? She talks about, and maybe I don't know if you feel about this, about the way one is haunted when kind of digging into this. I was haunted by the story of Manuel de Ruz. And I was haunted in the sense that like I just needed to know what did these men look like, speculatively speaking, right? I didn't know where I was going in terms of the contractual, but this, I guess the sort of difference between the contractual and the embodied sort of visceral aspect of history.
Just to add, so not just did these 9 men not want to give up one person, right? So they stuck together and they said, we did this all together. They knew that the Dutch West India Company would not execute all of them because that would be a large part of their manpower. So they kind of, took their chances in thinking that perhaps this could mean that they all would avoid execution. Now what happened is that the Dutch West India Company approached it by having them through the lot. Oftentimes it's like drawing of straws, and whoever has the longest straw has to, it's considered the person who will be held responsible.
We'll let God decide.
Yeah. So Manuel de Ruz was the one who was executed. But what's interesting there too is that they placed 2 ropes around his neck. He was supposed to be executed by hanging. And both of those ropes broke at the moment that he falls down. And the documents note that the executioner was a black person. And so you can't help but wonder, right? Like, were these ropes tampered with? Was this another effort to save the life of this one person? And it does happen because the people who are there, as he falls to the ground still alive, are all pleading with the council to give him his freedom and let him live, and the council does. So I just wanted to add that to your story. And then when it comes to the conditional freedom that you mentioned, and just the council minutes and the different agreements, the petitions of the enslaved people in this colony, you see that they have an understanding of their place within society. They have an understanding of how the law works, of how the council works, of how the company works. And they navigate that in a very sophisticated way. And so when they, in 1644, so just like 4 or 5 years later, they're able to obtain their freedom, or a conditional freedom. It's 11 men, and most of them were part of that murder. Yet, you can't help but wonder, how is this possible? Like, these men were about to be executed just a few years ago, and now all of a sudden they're given a conditional freedom. But they understood that they could, and I have some, I'm speculating as to what might be some of the reasons why that was, and why that was possible. But yeah, and it's all documented in that in those in those documents in those council minutes. So perhaps not so much contracts, but they're definitely like legally binding. And this is what is interesting when we talk about the context of contracts, is that we see that enslaved people in New Netherlands understand that these documents are what keeps them free. And there are some references to enslaved people wanting certificates that proves that they're free, especially when the English are about to take over the colony in 1664. They understand that they need something in writing that shows that they are actually freed people and not enslaved.
I'm still waiting to find out who's going to make the movie about de Ruz. I have my money. If anybody has Jordan Peele's phone number, please contact me after.
There is the rights to Russell Shorto's book, Island at the Center of the World, have been purchased, I believe, a long time ago, like years ago, and they've been in the process of creating a series of some sort. And I know that one of the efforts of the producers is to tell a more, to talk more about the enslaved people, because Shorto does not talk so much about the enslaved people. And that is one of the things that they're hoping to do. So who knows, maybe they will incorporate it.
And I'll have to speak to you about, issues of artistic license.
No, I think they should speak to some of the very descendants, the very Afro-Dutch, among several other ancestry and lineages. So some of the folks who are sitting right here who can trace their lineage back to some of what we're talking about. So this is not abstract at all.
Yeah, no, actually, I think that's kind of a brilliant point, because we're talking about, speculation about what they may have looked like and what they may have been thinking, and yet, they're exactly. Yes. Before we sort of let this point go entirely, you were just speaking for a moment about these issues of certificates and conditional freedom, et cetera. One of the things that you also kind of get into is this issue investigating this myth, basically, that the Dutch system of slavery was a more humane one. And I wonder if you'd speak a bit to that issue.
Yeah. This became very prominent in the 19th century. It existed previously, and it continues until today. When you work on slavery in New York or in the North more generally, that there's oftentimes this perception that slavery was not as bad, if that's possible, right? Like how can you have not bad slavery? One of the reasons oftentimes given is that enslaved people lived in the same houses as their enslavers. They oftentimes worked on the same land. They worshipped in the same churches, and that oftentimes is kind of used to give some meat, if you will, to that presumption that slavery was more benign in a place like New York. And this is why I thought it was very important to look at spaces of enslavement, because when you look at the houses that these enslaved people actually lived in, yes, it was the same building as where their enslavers lived, but they lived in very different parts of that home, right? And they had no freedom of movement within those spaces. They could be separated from loved ones at any moment. These were spaces of forced labor, of abuse. And so when we think of the home as like a safe space, a place of domesticity and family, I would imagine that for most enslaved people, that's a very different experience in those spaces. And so I think that it's useful to really think about that, to really think about those places. And there's one quote that really, I think, captured this so well. It's from James Fenimore Cooper. He talks in his book Satan's Toe. He really describes that, like, slavery in New York was very different from that in the South. And he says because they lived in the same home. And he actually says then as one family. But you don't put your family members in a garret space with a lock on it, right? You don't sell your own children away. You don't treat them in the way that enslaved people were treated. You don't surveil them in the same way that you surveil enslaved people. And so this idea that somehow just because they're in the same structure would mean that they're part of the same family is just, astonishing. But it's a very persistent myth. And like I said, something that we still hear today. I mean, I've heard it. I don't know if you all have heard it, but I've heard it many times.
I think my microphone's vanished now. But no, I wanted to say one of the things that we really tried to do with this book, which is about Levittown, and of course we're talking about the racially restrictive covenants that were in the wallpaper that Johannah created. And my father actually was born in 1950 in Bushwick and grew up in Levittown. And when we were looking at all of the covenants and other contracts that kind of made suburbia as segregated as it was, and kept wealth in the hands of white people, we wanted to make sure that we were quoting material from the North, that we weren't going back into this misconception that this stuff only happened in the South, that the South is a bad place full of bad people, and that the North is a good place full of good people. And Robert Moses and the way that he segregated the city, and that whole system also speaks to that same pernicious lie that things are better in New York. And, and to this day, New York, which, we all sit around and say is this really progressive city with progressive values, we have the richest people in the world here, and we have the poorest congressional district in America. So I think that that's kind of the inheritance of that.
School districts too.
The other interesting thing in terms of what you're speaking to with the domestic cohabitation is that in almost every racially restrictive covenant that I found on different suburban deeds, there was like the one exception for having a person of color in the space was if they were a servant.
Oh my God.
Whole issue of like sundown communities, right, where you're allowed to be in the white space in order to work, but then had to leave. You're right. It's a pernicious, I think, is a really apt word there in terms of legislation and contracts on the one hand, but then just social practice on the other. And then again, the mythologies. You talk a bit, we chatted a tiny bit about notions of utopia, right, and mythologies built into that. And I feel like there are two different utopias kind of at work and in play here. The new world, right, and the mystique and the promise of the new world on the one hand, and then the sort of space age future world, right, that the space age refrigerator ladies are sort of pointing to. And they're utopias that not only are people of color excluded from, but they're utopias that are created at their expense. And just knowing that you've kind of investigated this idea in particular of utopia, I wonder if you want to elaborate a little on that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the utopia also that we're looking at is the whole myth that somehow being anti-communist and pro-capitalist was patriotic. So you have the end of World War II, and it just kind of stays and becomes the Cold War instead. So I mean, I think that when I look at somebody like Robert Moses, who, and I mean, we talked about this. It's like what's really compelling about him, and like almost like Ahab-like, is that he started off as one of the progressives and like one of the good guys, but there was always a rot at the core of that. There was always no consideration of desegregation, of anything like that. So it just kind of, when you had these roads that went in and wealthy people had cars, and you built a city that was for cars, not for pedestrians, and you just used those highways to ghettoize the people that you considered undesirables. And that just sort of painted a picture of what kind of utopia we were exporting in the Cold War as part of a Cold War effort. And that's why I think that the World's Fair is very compelling in terms of modeling utopias, because you have the panorama, you have New York as this model city, and the first one to get all of these road systems that were then copied all over America. And that's something that's very important to both of us about what Robert Moses did, was that it was copied all over the country. It was a model for segregation and a model for putting the car out and putting that kind of industry and mineral extraction out there. But at the same time, it was also welcoming the whole world here, and why, I like that you went to the kitchen, because the kitchen debates in Moscow were just such like a literalized, really batshit kind of expression of this idea that we're going to win the war, as Robert A.M. Stern put it, and he said it about the 1939 World's Fair, not the 64 one, but he said that it was the last time that we thought that the Republic could be won with a dishwasher. And I really liked that quote a lot. And utopia is violent, and it's a top-down thing, and I think that that is what our exploration of it was about, for me anyway.
You've said a lot of the things I would have said. The only thing that I wanted to mention, which I guess goes maybe back to the previous point though, is thinking about like who gets into utopia and who's left out. That part of that mythologizing of it, particularly of the suburbs, as just being like, well, this is just who decided to live there, and this is just who could afford to buy a house there. This idea that we think of it as like social structures, like, oh well, white people just want to like live next to white people, and black people want to live next to black people, and like it being this social thing. And then you look at the history of the legality, and it was like actually like a lot of the there's a really good book that I recommend called The Color of Law that was really influential, and maybe you've read it. is super influential in my research because it really connects the dots where it's like actually there was more segregation after a lot of these housing policies were put in place than there were otherwise, and people just cohabitating mostly based on class. And then, you know, realizing like, oh, well, this law was put into place and then they made that illegal, and then they decided to, you know, start these racially restricted covenants or rezone certain neighborhoods as industrial, and, you know, all these little things, and then all of a sudden it just becomes this like, oh, this is just this model community, and these are the people who could live there. You know, like that you don't realize how actual sort of the funnel happens legally.
Just to add, not to add, but the connection I see with the earlier period is that it's about controlling the space, right? And it's about like who actually determines what the architecture looks like, or what names are on the streets, or what the layout of a town or a neighborhood or a suburb looks like. And it's a way of then also showing to people, I'm in charge. And you can be in these spaces, but only if you abide by my set of rules and my set of regulations. And that's very evident in all of those different time periods. And it's a very big part of like Dutch colonization, when they're actually building canals, right? Like they're trying to reconstruct the Netherlands in these other places that don't belong to the Dutch, right? But that's their way of asserting that those spaces do belong to them, and that other people are, yes, they're allowed to navigate those spaces, but only if they abide by Dutch rule. And that's what you continue to see into the 20th century. In different ways, of course, but very much like using the built environment to show who's legitimately there and who is not, or needs a reason to be there.
Okay, I finally did this correctly. Okay, so I have a little Ask the Historian moment right now, because I did grow up around here, and the way that I was taught about New York as a colony was that, you know, the Dutch were also special because they were so inclusive, and, you know, New Amsterdam was a melting pot, and that's why it was so much better than everywhere else. And you know, that's another thing that I think is very important to Levittown. You know, it was we subverted a World's Fair guide that is also in that show over there, and basically kind of took the research and made it into various you know, rides and attractions. And one of them that we talked about is a tri-faith triumph, because they wanted to have the exact same number of people who were Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish in Levittown, and that constituted diversity at that point in time. And everyone was white, of course. And you know, when you look at the way that the World's Fair also, you know, excluded so much of Africa, and you know, just kind of chose it was like a selective version of diversity. And that was another thing that, I don't know, I was taught growing up here, that was why the Dutch were somehow superior and everything was gentler here. And then of course there was having to learn a lot about Peter Stuyvesant, and you're like, why are we learning about this guy right now? We were like, ooh. And we were also talking about how Peter Stuyvesant and Robert Moses are kind of like, you know, good, like bad, great men of history, like great men of history gone awry, that you still have to learn about all the time. But yeah, I just wanted to know if you could kind of speak to that at all, like the whole diversity thing.
I mean, my immediate response would be like, no. It's a little bit more complex than that. I mean, we do see that because the Netherlands, because of its complicated history, we see more religious diversity in the Netherlands. And so there's a little bit more of that in perhaps New Netherlands than there is in New England, where you know, Puritans basically want to have a Puritans-only society, and everybody else is not welcome. But it's not as if they were promoting diversity, and it's not as if it was diversity also doesn't always mean tolerance, right? So yes, there were Jewish people in New Amsterdam, but they were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to bury their dead inside the town center. They had to do that outside of the main settlement. And so, and the same with enslaved people, that, you know, they they were working in chain gangs, you know, like it's not as if it was this wonderful, like, diverse, happy society. No, not at all. And it's, I think, one of the unfortunate kind of misconceptions about the Dutch. But yes, it's all relative, right? So when you look at other nations at the time, other countries or other areas, perhaps fighting wars over religious tolerance, then yes, you do see that in Amsterdam there were synagogues, you know, but there were no synagogues in New Amsterdam. Only the Dutch Reformed Church was allowed. People were allowed to practice their religions inside of their home in privacy, but not openly in any institution. So I think it's very overstated, and that's very unfortunate. But I think it worked for the Dutch for a very long time, and I think they're not always necessarily happy with the rewriting of that part of the history. But yeah.
Also, like this Northern European countries are always like thought of as more progressive, but basically the Dutch they just got here first.
It's really hard to hear.
I said that I think a lot of times Northern European countries are perceived as more progressive, but like I don't know much about the history. I'm not a historian, but from what I understand, the Dutch just were very, they were seamen, they were very practical, they had more experience with colonialism and enslaving people and living with all kinds of people than the British maybe. And so maybe they were just more successful in creating an illusion that would work for them commercially, maybe. I don't know.
I just as an example, I just wanted to point out that the title of this show, "The Price of Half Freedom," is literally part of the contract. When you say that it was a conditional form of freedom, that there was a literal exchange, like 30 schepel, am I saying that right? Schepel, like a measurement of corn, wheat, peas, some agricultural sort of annuity had to be paid in exchange for freedom. And that's what you realize is that almost every emancipation proclamation or every legislation around abolition of slavery has every single time been a conditional one. There's never an instance where freedom is not something that is not it's not given up without a fight, I guess.
Yeah, and in reference to your part on the commercial aspect, it is oftentimes, that's how the Dutch history is oftentimes written, right? That the Dutch were focused on commerce and not so much on colonization or warfare. When in reality, the Dutch West India Company was actually founded as a war machine against the Spanish. So at its core, that was what it was for. And then the other part was that it actually had in its founding documents that it was to settle to people the land of other areas. So colonization was also very much a part of that. But over time, this idea that the Dutch somehow were so focused on commerce that they would tolerate other people, you know, if that would gain wealth, that has become a dominant narrative. And some parts of it, yeah, true, but the bigger story is much more complex and certainly not, it's much more complex. So, yeah.
I'm just thinking that, you know, the other part of what was required for conditional freedom was also that your children remain enslaved and children that had yet to be born, right? So in that sense, you're never really free, right? And also, I believe you talk about this in the book. There were sort of like hierarchies of slavery, right? So there were the chain gangs, and then there was like domestic enslaved laborers, and then there were you know, maybe people who gained half freedom, but that in many ways that was kind of a strategy for submission.
Yeah. This is where, you know, some of this is kind of just kind of piecing things together, right? So there's no document that actually says that. But we see that when people are actually able to obtain a conditional freedom, which is very much, you know, always there's the possibility that they could be re-enslaved. And the conditions were awful, especially in the case of the 1644 case where these families, you know, their children would still remain enslaved, even the ones who are not yet born. But the, what was your question? Sorry. Oh, the hierarchies, yes, sorry. So the hierarchies, so one of the things that I see when looking at these documents is that promise of conditional or full freedom, because some of them did eventually get full freedom, was also a way of, it could be used by the Dutch West India Company, right? So oftentimes it's interpreted as this part of Dutch tolerance or being somehow more kind, or but you could also see it as effectively a way to keep people in control, because if there is a possibility that you might one day become free if you go by the rules, then that takes away some of your motivations perhaps for more outright resistance or running away, because that is more likely to get you working in the chain gang or lifelong enslavement. So it could be used to then also keep people in bondage, this promise of freedom. And we see in the documents people who are getting their freedom actually are referencing that they had long been promised their freedom. So it was something that kind of was put out there for people, but you had to work towards it, right? And there's actually some cases where I believe that some of these enslaved people were fighting in some of the wars, especially the Second Aesopus War. We know that people enslaved by the company were fighting in that war, and some people are very soon after that war obtaining their freedom, and they're always men. And so it's very possible that those are the men who actually were fighting in that war, and the promise for fighting against the Aesopus was that, you know, they might get their freedom if they do so. So yes, I think it's a possibility, a way of kind of creating these hierarchies and this promise of freedom, using that to keep people enslaved in some way.
This might be slightly far-fetched, but it makes me think of the sort of more 20th century notion of and mythology again of like rags to riches, right? America is this place of opportunity, right? Anybody can become president and whatever, right? It seems to me that, again, a lot of what the both of you have been investigating, and even our just brief conversation before this began, in terms of these like sort of crazy Venn diagrams of like American infiltration or control of other countries, it just feels like it's all intertwined.
Totally, and I think that part of that, like when I'm hearing you speak about this, I just think about like consumerism and the idea, like aspirational living and aspirational kind of wealth is part of that, of being like, you know, we're not going to burn things down if we think that we might get a piece of that someday. And it's that same kind of like, yeah, just that kind of like getting constrained by capitalism and consumerism that really kind of doesn't allow a lot of sort of radical stuff to happen.
I mean, I remember, and this is a much more recent example, but you know, when all of the Black Lives Matter protests were happening in 2020 and everybody got out in the streets, you know, I mean, I have friends from college, went to a pretty conservative university, and I have a lot of friends who were in the center and the right, and they all said, you know, the only reason that people are getting out there in the streets right now and protesting is because they're not going to work. And it's like, yes, correct. That's exactly what it is that, you know, you're stuck at your job, you're stuck paying for your mortgage, and, you know, because you have these things that are held over you and you have commitments to loved ones and you're just trying to keep afloat and be a person and have a life and have an emotional life, you pay for that. You're made to pay for that privilege. Here it's a privilege to be, you know, to have that kind of contentment. So basically, you are held to all of these obligations, and that American dream and the shape of it, and I think the normative shape of it, and how much it costs is definitely central to how you keep people down. But the only other thing that I wanted to add on before we totally leave this entirely in terms of New York exceptionalism, I mean, like, we call ourselves the Empire State, for Christ's sakes. And I think these bricks are so amazing. I just think that they're such a great part of the show, and we haven't talked about it yet here, but I just think that that actual idea, I think that that kind of exceptionalism is a building block, and I think that the way that it also deludes people into accepting less or thinking like, you know, there's a hustle here, that you're getting something out of it, and I think that's kind of like a mental illness here in a lot of ways, you know, and I mean, like, I don't really know anybody who doesn't have it, but I think at base there is just that larger, you know, consumer experience of just paying for all these things that you want.
Very briefly, I have I'm a recovering brick collector. I'm trying to quit, no, these bricks did come from the original brickyard where they were made on the Hudson Valley, which is a giant glacial bed of clay. So everywhere from Albany to Staten Island, there were eventually, at some point, reaching its peak in 1906. This is a real brick nerd talk here. Brickyards up and down the Hudson River, and I think what's exceptional about these bricks in particular is just knowing the way in which several of New York City's housing projects, including in particular Stuyvesant Town, were built, which was originally designed and built as a segregated housing public-private partnership with the municipal government of LaGuardia, I think it was, at the time. That when you look at photographs of those brickyard workers, there's Hungarians and, you know, Irish and, you know, sort of any mix of recent immigrants, and also a lot of black faces. So to think, the irony for me is to think that those bricks, those building blocks, literally, like you said, could have been made by black brickyard workers for a unit that they themselves would not have been able to live in, is sort of a real whiplash of historical irony that is sort of what motivates my work. I mean, it's not Rosh Hashanah anymore, but I'll share my little piece of wisdom that I was lucky enough to get, which is the idea that the gap between who we present ourselves to be, whether that's a society or a planning board or, you know, just individually, the gap between who we present ourselves to be and who we are, you know, at home in the pajamas when nobody's looking or whatever, that's the measure of the spiritual work we have to do. So the gap between what's presented here, you know, in terms of documentation, whether it's a history, whether it's the contractual obligations, and the actual living of those documents is very often a large gap. And if the arc of the universe bends towards justice, I feel like it's more like a wave. It's like it's going to go rolling, sort of back and forth movement. If it does bend in that direction, hopefully that gap will close. So, props to Rabbi Brent Spodek.
In just say that I love that idea of the bricks, and I don't know if you know, oh, I'm blanking on his name now, Joe of the Slave Dwelling Project, McGill. Yeah, and he's really fascinated with this, the bricks that have the fingerprint of the enslaved people who built the houses. One of the things that I found in the case of New York, so yes, they oftentimes were living in those houses, even though they were like in the garret spaces or in the basements. But what you were saying about the homes that they were not, or the buildings they were not allowed to live in, it right away brings me back to the churches, the Dutch Reformed churches that enslaved people were building, and they were not allowed to worship in them, right? And it's such a big part of that history, and yet the fingerprints in the bricks, you can actually every now and then find them in houses from still that era. So yeah.
Those issues feel like so poignant. I feel like maybe it's a good moment to pause for a second and open it up for comments or questions. Anybody have any?
I don't know.
No, I just want to thank all of you for bringing this history to life. I think of how fortunate I was to first come to New York in my first year. They discovered the African burial ground. And I was part of a Cuban grad school when we were protesting. And I remember that they just wanted, and I keep thinking of my own struggle with my own cemetery in Greenwich, where they just want to put a plaque on the building and say no. And so, I'm looking at that little space of bricks over there in Empire, and I'm thinking of what if history had just said, okay, put the plaque on the wall. Look at all of what would have been the bricks. And in my own work and my own research, I'm obsessed with bringing my ancestral stories to life. I'm a descendant of many Afro-Dutch, but also the Afro-Dutch who were mixed with Lenape, who ended up in the Tappy Caddy. And our stories have been told by others, and it's not the true story. So, again, there's a lot of work we need to be done, a lot of stories that are out there, a lot of misconceptions that will be clarified, and new historiographies that need to be written that tell our truth from our perspective about our ancestors and not this top-down, outsider perspective. So I'm glad that, and I'm an artist, so I love that. So I'm so happy to see you, see my old friend and new friend.
Just what you're saying, it reminds me of something that you mentioned earlier, and I think is a big part about the history of slavery in the United States. So much of what we have to do is like unlearning, because so much of the history that we were taught is not the correct history. And so it's not just learning, but also unlearning the things that we previously have been taught. And it's so important that that work is done. So yeah.
And take what we through these a lot of times and it's really very interesting, especially my days in classes. I didn't see a couple of students. It's not correct. You can feel them? So is it lost? Oh, yeah. You say so, then yeah.
Yeah, no, my one comment from that comment would just be, Lisa, thank you so much. I was just blown away, I have to say, when, Johannah's stuff looks so great in the space, but, then coming back here and seeing this, and I was just so completely bowled over, and, making that connection and putting me in the room with everybody here has just been a real honor, and it's just been amazing working with you, and thank you for just, doing all of this.
Thank you. And I will say it's always a pleasure to work with artists, but it has been an exceptional pleasure to work with the both of you and to be a part of these projects, which I just think are really hopefully starting to begin to do some of that work of helping us unlearn and start to relearn, you know. So thank you. And thank you for all of your work.
If you want a book, I've got books. Books for sale, right here. You need it. I'm telling you. Come read your history. Yes, in the White Flight magazines. Yes, yes.
I also just, I want to reiterate a huge thank you as well to everyone, especially Lisa. But I also, what I think is so great about your curatorial vision for this is because you really would think, oh, this is like this sort of historical piece back here, a very different time, very different narrative, and then the front show, obviously different aesthetics, but like I felt immediately when I knew what your show was about, I was like, oh, 100%, we're talking about it's the same shit, it's just like, in the suburban space or in these other, and so I feel like you being able to recognize that through line, which maybe from the outside seems tenuous, but I actually think is very connected to, all of these different, it's like these different structures that get replicated in these, that we have to break at some point.
You talking even and explaining me through it, I didn't actually see the connection. Yours was oh, I remember this. but seeing it with the and seeing it with the control spaces, seeing all of the themes with the feel right. Thank you, because this is really helpful. Very nice. Thank you all for coming.
All right.
Thank you.